So, if you wander into my office and you look at my bookshelf, you will see these old, very dusty commentaries. And for those of you who are the sort that knows all the commentaries, in other words, the other pastors, okay, and those who are particularly theologically minded, you'd look at them and you go, Pastor, those are really old, theologically way out of date. And I'd say, well, sort of. I mean, I inherited them from my grandfather, who had spent 30 years in ministry as an Episcopal priest, and he got that when he first got out of seminary, back in the ye old time period. Okay? But the reason I keep them is because you don't know where you're going unless you know where you came from. Right? A Google map is not helpful if you don't know your starting location. If you don't believe me, just go in, put in where you're going, but don't tell Google where you are. And it freaks Google out. Right? I know Google knows, but if you don't share it, if you do it from a computer, okay, it won't give you a map. And I think this is sort of true whenever we read the scriptures. We need to know where we were and where we're going, because sometimes new ideas are bad ideas that you can't figure out are bad ideas until the new idea has become an old idea. You guys follow all that? If not, that's why I record it and send it out on Facebook later. Okay? And today we run into one of those, which is the understanding of who the shepherd is in the shepherd and sheep scenario. Throughout all the Gospels, you're going to run into this analogy in which Jesus is going to speak of a shepherd and of the sheep. And he's going to have all sorts of different reasons for there to be shepherds and sheep. But throughout the Bible, he's going to be really explicit, just like he was here, that the shepherd is God. Right? The shepherd is always God. And the sheep is all of us all, myself included. Okay? And if you were to go into those old, dusty Interpreter's Bible, not the New Interpreter's Bible, we're talking the original one, or the Anchor Bible again, not the new Anchor Bible series, the original dusty ones, and open it up, they would remind you, as you hit any of these, that whenever you're speaking about the good shepherd or the shepherd, that this is going to be an analogy to God and humanity and the interactions and relationship between God and humanity. And this one in particular is letting you know a really important thing. What makes God happy? Right? Throughout the Old Testament, if you've ever read it, it tells you a lot about what makes God angry. But it doesn't tell you a lot about what makes God happy, right? And if we're going to have a relationship with someone, and here's a sort of relationship hack, it is important to know what will make your spouse mad, right, guys? But it is even more important to know what makes your spouse happy, right? Because we should endeavor to get above just making our spouse mad. Or not mad. Right? There we go. Every wife just looked at the husband who did not shake their head yes. Okay? So, what we're learning is what makes God happy. And this is important to us when it understands what it means to be church. Because when we talk about what it means to be church, we got to remember whenever we run into these analogies that we're speaking of who God is and what God does and how we respond as the sheep. Now, what's interesting to me is that you have, if you were to continue to read more and more newer and newer commentaries, somewhere between my grandfather's generation and my dad's generation, you will see a subtle but really important and honestly, I think, horribly misguided switch in how churches understand these passages. The passages, you'll see the switch go from God being the shepherd and all of us humans being the sheep to the pastor or the bishop or the pope or some other human construct or human themselves being the shepherd, right? You all probably heard sermons. There are probably people giving sermons today where they stand up and say, "Hey sheep, how are you doing? I'm the shepherd." Okay? But this isn't just wrong, it's really problematic. And it's really problematic for lots of reasons. And I think we can see that if we start to look at it through the two different lenses. The older lens of it being about God, and the newer lens of it being about some sort of church authority. For example, one of the big questions I am asked, being a millennial, especially from other millennials, since there's a large group of millennials out there that are spiritual but not religious, if you poll them, is they'll come to me and they'll say, Pastor, I found a church, and I like the church, and I believe in God, and I'm going to church, but what is up with Christian culture? It is weird. And I'll go, well, what did you observe? What did you see? And they'll tell me the story of someone in a church doing something really awful to somebody else. Okay, I'll give you an example. When I was in Nebraska, I knew a woman who was in charge of her local WELCA group, in which if you volunteered to help out with WELCA, that's Women of the ELCA, by the way, if you don't know, and she would have you put together sandwiches to help feed kids. This sounds really good, right? And so you'd learn to put together PB&Js, right? And this would be really fun until you put the jelly on the wrong side of the bread. And then when you put the sandwich together, you put the jelly on the wrong side. And she'd like literally yell at you about this. Needless to say, no volunteer ever came back. Because that's the most ludicrous thing. And if you're thinking to yourself, what? How can it be wrong? It can't be. Okay, if you don't like it on the top, turn the sandwich over. Okay? And so what would happen, and what happens at a lot of churches, is eventually some leader comes to the person who's yelling and scaring all the new members and volunteers and says, hey, that's not okay. Okay? And so far, people outside of church get this move. But then the person goes, and many of us probably lived through this, they go, what? You don't value all that I do for this church? I have been here since Jesus. I founded this myself. I built the entire thing. Right? We've all heard this, like, overstatement. And then they go, well, my money and my time is going somewhere else. And they stomp off. Now, again, anyone who works with people in any arena has gone through this, even if it ain't a church. So to people who are unchurched, this does not seem weird. But what happens next is what is bizarre. And I've seen it over and over and over. Churches will spend an insane amount of energy, an insane amount of time going, oh my God, the crazy person left. We need them back. Not all the volunteers they scared away, the crazy person. We're going to put all our energy to going after that, and we're going to ask the pastor or the council president or some matriarch or patriarch of the church to run to the crazy person and go, please, 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 we need more bullies. Come on back. And that's where everyone who's outside church is like, why? No one who runs a coffee joint goes up to the customer who's screaming and runs out and sends their baristas out there going, no, please come back. Right? When I worked in finance, we were allowed to fire customers. Like, we had to justify it, but we were allowed to fire them. In most places, somewhere up the chain of command, there's a point where if you're an awful customer, they will just say, you know, have you thought about that coffee shop? If you're at Starbucks, they'll introduce you to Dunkin' Donuts. Okay? And yet, churches spend lots of time, lots of energy, often being far more concerned about the perpetrator than they do about the victim. And I think that comes from this change in how we started to read these passages. Because if the passages were about God going and getting that person who stomps out mad, and us concentrating on being the best flock we can, the most hospitable place for them to come back to or not, making sure that we are caring about everyone, even the people who, make PB&Js wrong. Okay? And we just said, God bless you. I hope God finds you. I hope God picks you up, throws you over God's shoulder, and brings you back. That would follow if God's the Good Shepherd. However, if I'm the Good Shepherd, then what does that mean? That means you are the only flock, right? There's no sending them to another flock because you're the shepherd's flock. So we better run out there and go grab that person because they're the lost sheep, because if they're not in our church, they clearly have been lost. Where if they're God's sheep, then maybe God will find a better place for them. Another location. A place where they're frankly happier. I grew up in a church that, in hindsight, as a pastor, I look back at it. It was a great blessing to me, core to my growth, core to who I am. Some of the best people in my life I met at St. Margaret's Episcopal Church. But looking back, with the benefit of hindsight, I realized a few things about its history. The first thing is that St. Margaret's was completely dysfunctional in hindsight. We had a group of old colonels that would get together and just run everything, and who cares what council thinks? Okay? We've had some of those, the native church, right? They were called the Colonel's Corner. They even had a group they called the Colonel's Corner. If you hadn't been a colonel, you were not invited. Okay? And that Colonel's Corner made all the decisions, no matter who was elected. This was not healthy. Now, these were good people. These were wonderful people. Some of these people were mentors in my life. But I realized something in hindsight, that the best thing that ever happened to St. Margaret's Episcopal Church was a horrible church fight that occurred while I was at college. Because you know what happened to the Colonel's Corner? They got mad, they left, all of them went to different churches. And those churches were blessed by those people. Because they were hardworking, good, and faithful people that alone were wonderful parishioners. And together were insufferable. You may have friends that having dinner with them alone is wonderful. Having dinner with all of them is awful. Maybe your family, who knows? Just thinking of Thanksgiving. But here's the thing. I think it's one of those things where we made a small move, not really thinking it through, that wasn't necessarily the most truthful to the Bible, because the Bible's really clear in this passage. It's talking about God, right? At the end of it, it says this is how God reacts when God saves this person. And Luke does that explicitly over and over and over, I think trying to avoid the interpretation that somehow we started to land on between my grandparents and my parents' generation. An interpretation that then leads us to sort of silly things that the outside world looks at and goes, what are you all doing? So as you go out this week, I want you to take a few moments. First thing I want you to do is ask yourself, are you running with that interpretation anywhere of me or the bishop or the church being the shepherd? Because God is the only shepherd. And that's fundamentally a different relationship, because if you're sheep and I'm a sheep, then we're all in this together trying to figure out what the shepherd's telling us to do. That's one type of relationship, right? On the other hand, if I'm shepherd and you're the sheep, then my job is to tell you what to do and your job is to pray, pay, and obey. And I think that's really destructive. Because what does that do? It turns you into spectators of religion and me into a practitioner of it. When the reality is, Christianity is not a spectator sport. Christianity is about being God's hands in this world. Why? Because I'm a sheep, you're a sheep, and our goal, our only real goal, is to listen to the Lord Almighty and to ask every day, how can I be your hands in this world?